Hello and welcome to topic 2, where we're going to be learning about the public policy process. And in this lecture, we're going to take a look at the introduction to the public policy. So what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define some terms. We're going to look at the terms government, politics, and public policy. This class is, as you know, a gender studies class, but it's also a political science class. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to key political science terms. We're also going to be taking a look at key features of American government. It's very possible that a lot of you already know how American government works, but we can always use a refresher on American government. It's important to learn about this because public policy is a product of American government. So before we can talk about the public policy process, we have to make sure that we're refreshed on the different institutions and process of American government. We're also going to take a look at some key features of American democracy, which are the separation of powers and checks and balances. And then we're going to conclude the lecture by looking at why study public policy. What are the benefits of studying it? So let's get started. Okay, let's get started with the term government. Now, government is defined as the institutions and procedures through which a territory and its people are ruled. And for those of you who are taking my American government class, that definition is going to look pretty familiar because it comes from our textbook written by Weir et al. And so when you're talking about government, you're really talking about the institutions that are making decisions and implementing those decisions that are going to affect the people that are living within a specific territory. There are lots of different kinds of governments. Some governments, all of the power is embodied in one individual, like a king or a queen, and that's what's known as an autocracy. But in the United States, the power to govern is embodied in the people because we are a democracy. And that leads us to our next term, which is constitutional democracy. Now, constitutional democracy, the word democracy means rule of the people. Demos, the people. Cracy means to rule. And so at the end of the day, when it comes to decision making in the United States, the political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. That doesn't mean that people are day in, day out making public policy. We don't live in a direct democracy. In other words, we don't ask the people that live in the United States to vote on whether they want to implement a certain policy or not, at least not in the national, at the national level. Some states do ask the people that live in that state do they want to enact a particular policy, and that's what's known as direct democracy. But at the national level, we don't have that. At the national level, we have what's known as a representative democracy or a republic. And the way in which people let what what they want government to do, the way they let that to be known is by who they elect to serve in our government. But at the end of the day, the ultimate political authority rests with the people. We're also a constitutional democracy. And what that means is that in a constitutional democracy, there's a constitution, and that the power of the government is limited by the Constitution. We have a federal constitution. We also have state constitutions. But at the end of the day, if you live in a constitutional form of government, it basically means that government can't do whatever it wants. There are formal limits on their power, and those formal limits are outlined in a constitution. Another aspect of constitutional democracy is that the rights of the people are identified and that they're protected. We have that in the American constitutional democracy. We have this thing called the Bill of Rights and other amendments that protect the rights of the people, and we place an obligation on government to make sure that the rights of the people are protected. And so government comes in many different forms. One form of government is constitutional democracy, and that's the kind of government that the American system has. Now, when the United States was founded in the mid to late part of the 18th century, and so the United States declared its independence from Great Britain in 1776, as we all know, July 4th. And then, we ratified our Constitution in 1788. And so when we were creating our new government, and we decided that our framers wanted to create a republic, a form of democracy, they were very aware that democracy was, not a very popular form of government at that time. In fact, very few governments in the world had democracies. Most governments had what were known as autocracies, where one person would do the ruling, a king or a queen. And the reason for that was because democracy, rule of the people, was seen as an unstable and sometimes dangerous form of government. That when you let people make decisions, well, could possibly be uneducated, they could be irrational, they could be self-interested, just looking out for the interest of themselves and their particular group and not looking out for the common good. And so the thinking is that highly educated kings and queens who have a long heredity line of ruling would know how to rule in such a way that was for the good of everybody that lived in that territory. But our framers didn't want an autocracy. That's what they fought against, the King of Great Britain. So they wanted to create a democracy. But they were realists, and they knew if there weren't certain mechanisms in place to make sure that the people that were in our government if there weren't mechanisms in place to make sure that they didn't abuse their power, they would abuse their power. So in crafting the American government, framers such as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton made sure that there were certain mechanisms in place to make sure that power wasn't going to be abused. And one of those mechanisms is what's known as separation of powers. And what separation of powers is that power, the governmental power, is divided into separate groups. If you put all the power in the hands of one institution, or if you put all of the power into the hands of one person, like a king, hey, I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier for that power to be abused because there are no checks on that power. Our framers wanted to put the distinct powers of government in different institutions with the thinking that if you give each institution its own set of powers, when that institution tries to actually abuse its powers and engage in powers that weren't designated to it, the other branches would push back and say, hey, get out of our lanes. You're engaging in a power that you're not authorized to exercise that kind of power. And that's what separation of powers is. Separations of powers takes the different powers of government, divides it into specific institutions. And so one institution is what's known as the legislature. And the legislature is the one that makes decisions, creates public policy. And in a second, we're going to be looking at the different kinds of decisions that legislatures make. In the United States, at the national level, the legislature is embodied in an institution called the United States Congress. And there's two chambers of the United States Congress because, again, the framers wanted to make sure that when decisions were made, they kind of had to go through two different bodies with different sorts of interests. The House of Representatives is a much bigger body. The representation is based on population. So the bigger your state is in terms of population, the more voice you get in the House of Representatives. Wisconsin's a relatively small state in terms of population. We have 8 members of the House. California has 54. It's much bigger, much more populous. But our framers were also worried that if all the decisions were just made by majority rules, that those who were not in the majority could get trampled on the will of the majority. So they wanted to make sure that there were some checks on the demands and the will of the majority, of majority rule. And the way they did that is they created the Senate. And so the Senate, as we know, each state gets equal representation regardless of how large its population is or how small. So Wyoming gets 2 senators, one of the smallest states in the union, but so does California and Texas and Florida. And so the House of Representatives, 435 members based on population. The Senate, 100 members. Each state gets 2. Another power of government is the power to take decisions and to put them into action. And that's what the executive branch does. It implements the decisions that the legislature makes. At the federal level, there are 2 entities that make up the executive branch of government: the President of the United States and the so-called federal bureaucracy. There are 15 federal departments that are charged with implementing federal law after it's been signed into law passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. And so, an example of a federal bureaucracy is like we have the Department of Health and Human Services, we have the Department of State, and I put up there the Department of Justice. Because the Department of Justice is important when it comes to public policy that deals with gender. One of the things that the Department of Justice makes sure is that people aren't discriminated against. So we have certain laws in the books. For example, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and you're going to be learning about that in this class. And in that federal law, it says that you can't discriminate uh, in employment on the basis of sex. So in other words, you can't hire somebody because they're a woman or because they're a man, that you can't discriminate on that basis. Now, if you feel like you have been discriminated on the basis of sex or on the basis of race, you would take that complaint to the Department of Justice, in particular, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. And so that I use that as an example because it's a good example of that when laws are created, they need to be implemented. And the way that they're implemented is if those laws are violated, then there needs to be a mechanism to make sure that companies are following the laws, that they've been properly implemented. And then finally, we have the judiciary. And the judiciary at the federal level is the Supreme Court and the federal courts. Now, keep in mind, all states also have state legislatures, state executives, governors, and state judiciaries as well. We'll be talking about those throughout the course of the semester. But we're starting with the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court is the court of last resort. And it settles disputes regarding the constitutionality of laws. So throughout the semester, you're going to see that laws are implemented, and the question becomes, are those laws actually constitutional, or do they violate the Constitution? And the Supreme Court of the United States determines. It settles the dispute about the constitutionality of law. And so that was sort of one of the mechanisms. Separate out powers, so each institution has its own powers. And then that way, if one institution tries to go and try to do a power, like if the legislature tries to implement laws or if the judiciary tries to create laws, then the other institutions push back and say you're not allowed to do it, thus placing a check on the exercise of power. Another mechanism that was put in place to make sure that power wasn't abused is the mechanism of what is known as checks and balances. And what checks and balances are is that each branch participates and influences the other branches of government. And learning about checks, in other words, that no one branch can really do its job without the influence and oversight and cooperation and participation of another branch. Now, we're learning about checks and balances and separation of powers because both of these are really important to understand the public policy making process. One of the things you're going to learn during the course of the semester is it's hard to get policy passed. And a lot of that has to do with checks and balances because when you pass a law that you have to, when Congress passes a law or any state legislature passes a law, oftentimes the executive, the president or the governor has veto power. And so sometimes a law will get it passed through the legislature, but it never gets enacted because the president will veto it. And it's not impossible. Congress can override a presidential veto with 2/3 of a vote, but it becomes more difficult. But the framers thought it was, again, essential that we wanted to make sure that branches had to work together cooperatively because they felt that if there was cooperation and oversight, that would bring us closer to laws that would benefit everybody within our nation. And so each branch participates and influences the other branch by checking its power and providing some oversight, but also they cooperate in decision making. And so that going with the example of Congress passing a law and knowing that the president can veto it, well, Congress might be more likely to pass a moderate law, pass a moderate bill, because if the Congress is Democrats and the president is a Republican, or vice versa, you want to have a bill that's not too far to the left or too far to the right, because you know that president is not going to enact that. So it kind of encourages cooperation as well. Some examples of checks and balances are, as I mentioned, Congress passes a bill. It's signed into law by the President of the United States, but it can also be vetoed by the President of the United States. Yet, that veto can be overridden by Congress with a 2/3 vote. Another example is that Congress reviews the constitutionality of laws passed and also the way that laws are implemented. Again, we'll be talking about this through the course of the semester. The Constitution and federal law is the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so it could be possible that Congress passes a law that actually violates the Constitution of the United States. It's also possible that a state could enact a law that violates the Constitution of the United States. We see that right now with the Texas abortion bill that was passed by and signed into law by the Texas legislature and signed into law by Governor Abbott in Texas. And there's a lot of concern that that law is unconstitutional because it says that you cannot have an abortion after the first 6 weeks of pregnancy. And as it stands right now, women have a right to an abortion, or pregnant people have the right to an abortion up into the point of viability. And 6 weeks is well beyond viability. But the Supreme Court didn't take any action on that. They let the law go into effect. And so that if the Congress feels that the Supreme Court isn't doing their job, in other words, not placing an injunction or a stay on a law that's passed by a state that's clearly unconstitutional, well, Congress can take action. Again, checks and balances. They check the power of the Supreme Court. If they don't feel like the Supreme Court is exercising its power properly, they can change the size of the Supreme Court. Right now, there are 9 members on the Supreme Court, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says there must be 9. What the Constitution tells us is that the Congress has the power to determine how many members are on the Supreme Court. So if Congress wanted to, they could increase the size of the court and put a bunch of justices on there that respected the reproductive rights of women. Not that that's going to happen, but it's a good example of that interplay between checks and balances. All right, let's move on to define public policy. The chapter that you're reading this week from the textbook written by Thomas Dye defines public policy as the public policy is whatever governments choose to do or not to do. On one hand, it seems sort of like a vague or really broad definition of public policy. But what I like about that definition of public policy is I think that it really does sort of, exemplify exactly what public policy is. Public policy is actions that government take or actions that government, refuse to take. And so when we're learning about the public policy process, one of the first things we're going to learn about is that the first step in the public policy making problem is to identify a problem. And so sometimes people will see problems in society and they'll say, man, this is a problem. Government should do something about it. Whether that problem is homelessness or whether that problem is low wage or whether the problem is rising, rates of carbon emissions. It's identified as a problem, and then we ask government to do something about it. And when governments do something about it, it's public policy. Raise the minimum wage, address causes of and remedies for homelessness, reduce carbon, have policies in place that force reduced carbon emissions. But if they don't do anything, that's policy too, right? People continue to be homeless, people still struggle with the wage, and carbon rates continue to increase. And so I like the definition that Thomas Dye offers because I think it is a very a good reflection of what public policy actually is in the United States. Now, what government does or doesn't do falls into broad categories. So let's take a look at some of those broad categories. One thing that government does is it regulates behavior. It looks at the behavior within society and it says, this behavior is perceived as a problem, and therefore it needs to either be regulated or it could be prohibited altogether, criminalized. And so, some examples of behavior as it relates to gender and public policy are sexual assault and abortion. So we're going to be learning about public policy that has been put in place to regulate the behavior that is harmful sexual action. Whether that's harmful behavior such as an unwanted kiss or an unwanted groping or touching, all the way to a forcible rape. And so, the public policy has changed over time in terms of what constitutes sexual assault, and that is public policy, a behavior that is prohibited. Now, some types of sexual assault were not initially viewed as actual sexual assault. An example of that would be marital rape, if a husband rapes his wife. Up until the 1980s, that wasn't seen as harmful behavior, and we'll talk during the semester about why that is. And so that was a behavior that was not regulated for a vast period of time until the mid part of the 1980s. Abortion, again, terminating a pregnancy. That's a behavior that it continues to be regulated. Initially, you could only get an abortion prior to Roe v. Wade if the woman's life was in jeopardy. But today, a woman has a right, or a pregnant person has a right to an abortion prior to viability. But then after that, the state can regulate the behavior associated with terminating a pregnancy. Other examples are organizing society. Public policy takes actions to implements policies that have an impact on how we organize ourselves. Family is a good example of a way that the state can have an impact on how we organize ourselves into family units. Marriage, adoption. And so, as we know, up until almost it's getting close to 10 years, but probably closer to 7 years. Up until 7 years ago, same-sex couples couldn't get married. Now they can get married, and so we have a whole new way of. We're not really that new of a way, but that we've increased and diversified our state recognition of couples. Same with adoptions as well. Conferring benefits, so that government makes public policy decisions about who gets what. And so Badger Care, women, infant, and children, the Affordable Care Act that confers the benefits of contraceptives as a part of normal coverage with your insurance. Those are good examples of conferred benefits. And extracting and distributing money. Here's some examples that as governments make decisions about alimony. So when a marriage dissolves, one partner might need to pay the other partner alimony until they're able to find a job. And also making sure that money is going to be extracted from parents and given to children in the form of child support. Now, the final term we're going to take a look at here is the term politics. Now, throughout the course of the semester, you're going to learn that public policy is not made in a vacuum. That's why I have a vacuum cleaner there. That public policy is a result of politics. So what is politics? Well, politics is the conflict over the leadership, structure, and policies of government. Again, derived from my We the People American textbook by Weir et al. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that people in a democracy, they struggle in order to influence, who's going to lead us, who's going to be the president, who's going to, become our members of Congress, who's going to serve as our governor, right? And so people will go to the ballot box and they'll vote, and that the candidate that gets the most votes generally wins. And so people, that's politics. That you participate in the struggle over who's going to lead us, and oftentimes the people who lead us will make decisions about how our government is structured. For example, who's leading us? Congress. They might increase the size of the court, right? Changing its structure, and they also implement policies. All right. So politics is that struggle for determining who leads us, and then having a say on the kinds of policies that are implemented. Now, like I said, public policy is not made in a vacuum. Policy is a reflection of certain things. Public policy reflects values and reflects historical context, because oftentimes values change as we move from the 19th century to the 20th century to the 21st century as the historical context changes. Good example of that would be gender norms. Okay. And so that in the 19th and early part of the 20th century, there was a sense that that women were the meeker sex, the weaker sex, And that was a gender sort of norm, a societal expectation about women. And so because women were seen as a weaker sex, that there was a sense that public policy should protect women, particularly as women were in the workplace. And so that labor laws that were passed during the 19th and the early 20th century were all designed to protect women from the harms of working. And so there were laws that said that women could only work certain kinds of occupations, that they could only work X number of hours a day, because it was a reflection of values in a particular historical context, that is, that women are weak and need protection. Where we're at right now is a sense that men and women should be treated equally. Men can be weak and they can be strong. Women can be weak and they can be strong, right? That when it comes down to it, labor law should treat people equally. And also labor law should prevent discriminatory treatment. This is a good example of those values that get reflected in public policy. Public policy is also a reflection of political and social power. If you've got political power, the right to vote or the right to hold an office, well, then you're going to be able to implement certain public policies. If you don't have political or social power, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to influence the leadership structure and policies of government. As we know, vast portions of our society were prohibited from political participation. African Americans were not seen as full citizens of the United States until after the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment. They didn't get the right to vote until the 15th Amendment in 1870, but really didn't get the right to vote until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1960, or the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And so didn't have political or social power. Women that were the same didn't get the right to vote until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And even today, we're going to be learning that, when it comes to elected office, many more men hold elected office than women, making it more difficult for them to exercise a political power. And so public policy is a reflection of who has political and social power and who doesn't. And then finally, constitutional interpretation. Public policy must be constitutional, but the way the Constitution has been interpreted has changed over time. What used to be considered constitutional today is not considered constitutional, and vice versa. We get changes in our understanding of the Constitution. And so public policy is subject to the changes in constitutional interpretation. We'll be learning about that during the course of the semester. So in conclusion, we're going to take a look at why study public policy. Well, your textbook outlines 3 good reasons for studying public policy. And the public policy paper, you're going to be writing 2 of them this semester, are, really bring to life these reasons for studying public policy. One good reason to study public policy is because of description. That when you study public policy, you actually learn what's in the policy. You learn what government is doing. When you write your public policy paper, that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to identify an existing public policy that you want to learn more about, and that part of your paper is dedicated to describing the existing public policy. Another good reason for studying public policy is that the cause. What causes public policy? Why does government do what it is doing? Why is it enacting public policy, or why is it not enacting public policy? And so when you study public policy, you sort of study the historical context that surrounds the enactment of that public policy, getting a better sense of what caused it. And then finally, studying public policy is you get to examine the consequences of the public policy. And the consequences can be huge. And so what are the impacts of public policy? Does it effectively address the problem it was designed to address? And also, could it do a better job of effectively addressing the policy? Your public policy paper gives you an opportunity to explore that, because as you describe existing public policy in your paper, then you get to say, look, we can do better. This public policy falls short. And here's 2 alternative public policies that could do a better job at actually addressing this problem. And then you get to recommend one of those. Okay? So why study public policy? There's lots of good reasons. And in fact, those good reasons are going to be brought to alive as you write your public policy paper. All right, that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to be learning about the public policy process. Woot woot! So, for all you political science nerds out there, and now everybody's going to be a nerd, you're all going to be a bunch of policy wonks because you're in this class. On this next lecture, we're going to dig into that more deeply, and I think you're going to find it super interesting. All right, thanks for listening, and talk to you again soon.